Hi there, I'm Brendan Burns, CVP for Azure Resource Manager and DevOps in Azure. Have you been wondering the best way to describe and deploy resources to the Azure cloud? Well, the modern cloud-native way to do development and deployment of Azure resources is Infrastructure as Code, or IAC. With Infrastructure as Code, you use a simple text format to describe your resources, and then you can take that description and use it to reliably and repeatedly deploy your application around the world. Now, traditionally, infrastructure as code languages have been a little complicated, hard to learn, and honestly, not that much fun. With Bicep, a new infrastructure as code language from Azure, we've put a real focus on designing a language that's easy to start with, fun to use, and has great tooling in familiar environments like VS Code. Whether you're a beginner in the world of infrastructure as code or you have a bunch of experience in ARM templates, we invite you to join us on Microsoft Learn Live. There, we're going to have a series of lessons with subject matter experts on the Bicep team, helping you understand the best way to use Bicep to do infrastructure as code on Azure. Along the way, you'll learn Bicep basics, get to know the tooling in VS Code, and even learn a lot about Azure resources along the way. We're inviting you to come and enjoy this free learning experience in a series of weekly lessons starting Tuesday, March 8th, 2022. We hope to see you there.
Welcome to Learn Live, where we're going to be talking about building reusable Bicep templates using parameters. I'm Stephen Warowski. I'm a principal cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I focus on cloud native scenarios, DevOps, all that kind of fun stuff. Infrastructure as code is absolutely one of my passions. And today I am joined by Will. Will, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you do, how you came to Microsoft, or how you use Bicep?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. My name is Will. I am a customer engineer working in the Fast Track for Azure team based in New Zealand. I'm a fairly new Microsoftee, joined at the start of the year.
Welcome.
And thank you. Thank you very much. Seems like a cool forum to welcome me. Anyway, in terms of Bicep, I work a lot with customers who are fairly new to infrastructure as code, haven't really been doing it for a while, been provisioning stuff through the portal, and they're very new to Bicep. I also work with customers who are coming from an ARM background. So they've been working with ARM for some time, and now they want to see what Bicep is and what it does. And I've also worked with customers who have come from a Terraform background as well. So lots of variety, different customers wanting to learn about Bicep, which is pretty cool.
Very cool. And so we also have someone else helping us out today. So as part of this, you can ask questions live as we go through. And in our chat, we have Victor, who is, I believe, one of your coworkers, Will, right?
Yeah, he's a senior customer engineer on my team, and he's a DevOps expert. So he's my go-to person whenever I have questions about DevOps. So really lucky and really thankful for him joining us at 6 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand as well. He'll be answering all your questions in the chat. So please, any questions you have, ping him in the chat, and he's more than happy to answer your questions. Thanks to Victor for joining us.
And not only will he be answering questions, he'll be surfacing some questions back to us so that we'll have an opportunity to ask questions from you, our attendees, our audience, as we go through. So if you have questions, please ask them there. And we might even get to answer them live for you as we go. All right, let's get stepped into this here. So if you want to follow along at home as we go through this learn module live with you, so hence Learn Live, we have an AKAMS link here, AKAMS Learn Live dash, and then it's going to be our date, little date format there. 2002, 03, 22, and then A, because why not? Why not add a letter, add a little something? Or you can just hit the QR code. All right. Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about what our objectives are for today?
Cool. So the main purpose of today is we are trying to make our Bicep templates more reusable. So essentially, the part of the process of making them more reusable is introducing parameters, making them customizable, so we can actually change the values of those parameters depending on which environment we're going to be deploying to, and also limit the values of what we provide to those parameters. We'll talk about why that's important later on. Understand how we can actually supply those values to the parameters when we're performing our Bicep deployments, and also working with secure parameters, because there will be times when we deploy resources in our Bicep templates, we need to be aware and be mindful of security and how we handle those values. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today.
Very good.
Cool. So oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, so given those objectives, you want to give us a little, start us off on our introduction here?
Sure, why not? So by using parameters, we can actually make our Bicep templates more flexible and hence the title of the show, more reusable. Essentially, we define our parameters for any aspects of our deployment that might change, particularly environment-specific settings, pricing configuration, capacity configuration, because one resource in production might not be the resource you want to resource size, or you might not be the resource size you want to deploy to your dev environment, and any API keys or any access to external systems. Parameters, they can be configured to handle sensitive or securely handle sensitive data. So in this module, we're going to learn how you can define and configure those parameters and how we can actually specify those parameter values during our deployments.
Yeah, one of the really important things, right, is because Bicep is it is actually using the Azure Resource Manager. If we already have information in Azure that we can retrieve at the time of the deployment, that information we can just pull in as part of our template. But for some information we're not going to have there, and that's going to be context that is being provided by the person deploying the template, and so that's where parameters really come in, right?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a little bit of an example scenario. Steve, why don't you tell us what that scenario is?
You bet. So one of the things that we really like to do in our Learn modules is to define a scenario that might be recognizable to our audience, and it helps. If you think back to like a lot of the exams, if you've taken any of the Microsoft exams, you're an administrator for X, and you need to configure Y. We try to follow that pattern because it helps you kind of get a mindset for what we're gonna do. So in today's scenario, we're responsible for deploying and configuring the Azure infrastructure for our toy company. Our HR department is migrating this on-premises app and its database into Azure. And we want to handle all of the information about the toy company employees. So security is going to be important as part of this process. Now, given that scenario, Will, we've got a handful of goals. Why don't you walk us through those?
Well, it's with that scenario, it's always, like you said, it's always good to have those scenarios so we can actually conceptualize what we're trying to learn, right? So our scenario goals for this module is we'll have 3 environments we'll deploy to. And this is very similar to what it's like in the real world. So we'll have a dev environment, a test environment, and a production environment. And we're also going to be working with secure credentials. So what we'll be doing in our scenario is we'll actually be getting secrets from Key Vault for our database administrator name and also the password to our SQL Server as well. Those are values that we want to keep secure. We don't want to leak them. We don't, because they're credentials to our data. So we don't want that just being shared all over the place without any fork and given to security. So we're going to learn how we can actually secure those credentials and then use Key Vault and retrieve them from our Key Vault in our Bicep template.
Awesome. So with kind of with those goals in mind, right, we're going to build a reusable template with parameters. We'll define an app service and an app service plan. We'll also define a SQL Server and database, create a parameter file for our environment, and then we'll secure some of those parameters in Key Vault. And so ultimately, what we'll really want to be able to do is by the end of this module,
being able to, like you said, being able to have parameters that we can customize and also limit the values that we provide to those parameters, because that will, there are some limitations around what we give to our resources. We also want to understand how we can actually provide those values to our Bicep template. And we also work with those secure parameters to make sure that we don't leak our secrets and just tell the world, hey, this is the password to my database. We don't want to do that. That's not a good idea. So that's basically our goal for today.
Yeah, leaky secrets, not a good thing.
Not a good thing. So with that in mind, Stephen, what are parameters? Why are we here?
All right, so parameters. Now, parameters are a way that we can provide at runtime or at deployment time options into our Bicep template. And so if you've used any command line tool before, if you used a programming language before, parameters are a thing you're probably familiar with. It's the way we provide options into things so that we can get them to do what we want in the context of where we are now in our lives. So, we start out by wanting to define the things that we need to ask a user. It's basically like a bunch of questions, right? What do we want the person who's deploying this template to be able to provide? And Bicep provides, if we can go one step further here on the slides, Bicep provides a way to define those parameters in a nice, easy syntax, right? And we can actually put them anywhere in our template file, but by convention, we usually put them towards the top. So you have one place to look in your Bicep file for the parameters that are relevant for that module. And we define them with a particular keyword. We can give them a name, a data type, and actually let's go one more slide in, and let's really dive into the elements of this parameter. Now,
Yes.
Will, why don't you take us through this?
Well, declaring parameters is fairly straightforward. So, like you said, we essentially giving it our template in an instruction. So the param keyword will indicate to our Bicep template that, hey, this is a parameter. This is what we're going to be declaring it. So we start off by typing in param, and that's how we start creating our parameter. The environment name here refers to the name of our parameter. These can be anything we like, but as the objective of this is to make our Bicep templates as reusable as possible. So it makes sense to give it a name that's understandable by other users. So other developers in our team can look at our Bicep template, see our parameter name and go, oh, okay, that's what the parameter name is, and help guide them to provide a value that makes sense. The key thing to note about parameters is that they need to be unique within the template. And they can't share the same name as other resources or other variables within our Bicep template. And then string refers to the data type of our parameter. And we'll talk a little bit later about what kind of data types we can use for our parameters. But essentially, you'll have your param environment name string. So param is a parameter, environment name is the name of that parameter, and then string is the data type of that parameter.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really key points out of what you just outlined, and to me, one of the most important when it comes to naming things, and this might come from my PowerShell background, but I like clear, expressive names that are easy to read and understand, right? So and following a particular naming convention, right? Whatever it is, somebody's going to dislike your convention, but if you can stay consistent throughout, you actually make it so much easier for whoever's going to come next and read your code. Your template is going to be read way more than it's going to be written. And so using a good solid naming convention for your parameter declarations can be really, really helpful down the road.
It's also helpful to yourself as well. Because there have been situations where I've written some code and then I don't visit it for a while and then come back and I'll be like, what does that actually mean? So having descriptive parameter names is really helpful to both yourself and your teammates.
Yep. And one thing I've also seen happen is a lot of folks say, oh, parameters, great. Everything that could possibly change my template I should have a parameter for that so that I can be infinitely flexible. Now, what's your experience around that, Will?
You have to think very carefully about the parameters your templates use. Generally, a good rule of thumb is you should use parameters for settings that will change between environments. There are some variables and hard-coded values that you can use for settings that don't change within deployments. Don't try and over-engineer your Bicep template. Use parameters that make sense to say, okay, this will be my value for my dev environment. This will be the value for this parameter for the test environment, prod environment, etc. And that's a good candidate for using parameters. Not everything has to be a parameter.
Yeah, and you can always go back and make changes to your template, right? That's the whole point of infrastructure as code is we can change it as our needs change.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk a little bit about adding a default value. Will, you want to kind of run us through what's going on here?
Now, even though I've just said that parameters are good for values that change between different environments, we can actually use default values, and it's helpful in situations. Essentially, when we assign a default value for our parameter, we're making that parameter optional. So if we're deploying our template and we have a default value for that parameter, and at deployment time, we're not specifying a different value for that parameter, it's essentially going to use the default value. So some really good examples is, say, if we're deploying our Azure resources to a particular location, one thing I like to do is deploy all my related Azure resources within the same resource group. So there's a nice function that Bicep provides that we can just use the location for that resource group without actually having to type in, say, Australia East or West US2 or any other Azure region. We can just use the resource group's location, and we can provide that as default value for our location parameter, so we don't have to provide that at deployment time, which is pretty cool.
Nice. Now, we've shown a couple of examples of parameters that we've set are strings. If we move a little forward here, let's talk a little bit more about different parameter types. Now, because our template's designed to be written once and read or used a number of times, we want to be as helpful as possible to the person using the template, and therefore make them more likely to be successful with our template. So we can use different data types to tell users what we expect in those parameters. So string is going to be any arbitrary text. An int will let us use a number. Bool gives us true or false. And then we have object and array, which can represent structured data and list. And I think we really need to talk a little bit more about objects and arrays, because those can get a little tricky.
Yeah.
You want to take us through objects?
Absolutely. So like you said, we can use object parameters to combine structured data together in one place. And one of the great things about objects is that we can use multiple properties of different types within those objects. So we can use objects within resource definitions, within variables, within expressions within a Bicep template. So if we take a look at this example, I'm defining a object of app service plan SKU. So I've given it a name, which has a string value of F1, a tier, which also has a string value, and then capacity as an int value. Now, each of these properties has its own line. And when we reference this parameter within our template, what we can actually do is we can use a bit of dot notation here to access those individual properties. So we can go app service plan SKU dot name to retrieve the name from that parameter object. Do you have a good example, Steve, of where we might use an object parameter? Another example apart from this one?
Yeah, so another example might be something like tags, or maybe network configuration. It often requires some structured objects to go in. But we have, there's definitely there can be some dragons there. And our naming convention here, app service plan SKU, gives us a little hint as to what that object might contain. And we'll look at some stuff later too to help us provide some guidance in terms of what actually belongs in that object, because we can't define the structure of that object in our parameter reference, right, Will?
No, we can't. So it's important to just kind of keep in mind that you don't specify the type of each property within each object. But when we're actually using our object against an Azure resource, it has to match the value, the type that's expected. So using our previous example, we have the name and the tier of the app service plan. And those are expected to be strings, so we need to use strings. So with objects, we can define whatever we like within the object, but it still has to be a valid resource type that, well, it needs to be a valid type that the resource expects when we're actually deploying it.
Yep. And so using that naming convention helps us kind of match up what we're looking for. Now, the other data type I mentioned was arrays, right? And arrays also, we have some similar issues with objects. So an array is a list of items, and that list of items can be of any of the valid data types for in Bicep. So it could be ints, it could be bools, it could be, and they don't even have to be the same things, right? It could be ints, bools, objects, or strings. And since we can't say what belongs in that list, we really need to make sure that we lean on our naming convention and some of the other features in Bicep to help our user of our template really, find the right thing to go in there, right? And so we might have an array of objects, right? So think about, if we take a look at an example on the next slide of locations for Cosmos DB, right? We might want to have an array of objects here. The downside is nothing's telling me that that this array needs to contain this particular data type. So just something to be aware of and something to be a little cautious about. Now, let's take a look, Will, at some of the tools that we have with our parameters to help make things a little easier for the consumer of a template.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the tools that we have at our disposal to make our parameters a little bit more understandable is using decorators. Now, decorators give us a way to attach constraints and metadata to our parameter. And this is really helpful because if I'm using a template that I haven't authored myself, and if someone's put a decorator there, essentially that will help me guide me and understand and help me to understand what information I need to provide to my parameter when I'm using it. And there are a couple of tricks, different types of decorators that we can use. Stephen, do you know much about the allowed decorator?
Yeah. So one of the first things that we can use is this allowed decorator. And allowed takes a list, or takes an array, right? It takes an array of things. So, and those are valid values that you can provide the template, and you'll get an error saying, "Hey, no, it can only be one of these particular things." This is really helpful if you're in your environment. If you need to do something like, all right, we've approved these 3 SKUs for use in our environments, and so you could pick from those, or these are the regions that we need to deploy to, or that particular service is involved in. Now you can go a little overboard with allowed values, right, Will?
Yes, you can. It's always a good idea to use this very sparingly, because if we use it too broadly, if we use it everywhere, we could potentially block valid deployments if we don't keep those lists up to date. We maintain those lists, and we'll need to, if we don't keep them up to date, we can essentially block deployments. So a really good example is that SKU size for our app service plan. Yes, it can be good to just limit those values, to limit what we can actually deploy to certain environments. However, those SKUs change over time. SKUs get decommissioned, new offerings get provisioned, and there are new SKU sizes that we can use. So it's up to us as developers to keep those allowed values up to date and make sure that we don't prevent our team from deploying resources and stopping them from doing their jobs, basically.
Good to know. Now, another way that we can help provide some guidance on what belongs or what the parameter should look like is around the parameter length and values. For example, if it's Why don't you tell us about the length guidance that we can provide?
Sure. So there are situations when we're using string parameters, for example, we'll need to limit the length, sorry, of that string. So all Azure resource types have limits around the length of their names. So it's a good idea and it's good practice to specify the minimum and maximum character lengths that parameters can have to just control this naming and avoid any errors, sorry, during our deployments. And what we can do is we can actually use a really neat notation here: min length and min max length. We can use those decorators to apply minimum and maximum character lengths that you want to allow for a particular parameter. So for those of you who have a little bit of experience in Azure, will know that with Azure storage accounts, we have limitations on the lengths of it has to be between 5 and 24 characters. So in order to help our teammates out when they're using Bicep deployments to deploy Azure storage accounts, we can provide, or we can just decorate our parameter here with min length and max length of 5 and 24, and just essentially help the user say, okay, when I'm naming my storage account, it needs to be within these two different minimum and maximum lengths for the name.
Very cool. And there are corresponding, for integers, we can do min value and max value as well. Now, this type of thing can be kind of helpful, right? When we talk about length and value. I was actually working on a Bicep template with a coworker, and we kept bumping into a problem with the key vault secret names, because our secret name wasn't meeting the naming convention, and so our template was getting rejected, but it was with a not found error. So it was really hard to tell why our template was being rejected until we went back and we were able to, secret name, and we could put some constraints around it to help make sure we fell into that guidance. Now, you can apply, if we take a look, we got a tip or a little note coming up here that we can apply the min length and max length not just to strings, but to array parameters, so that we can tell how many items we can have inside that array. For example, you might want to limit an array if you were defining like a primary and backup region for where your application runs, if you were running like in a multi-region scenario. Or maybe you wanted 3, so you had a primary, alternate, and a contingency, or something like that. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about how objects and arrays can be kind of ambiguous in terms of what they take, but the next decorator gives us a way that we can help provide some of that guidance, as well as provide context for our other parameters. Will, why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, so what we can do is we can actually provide descriptions to our parameters. And with parameters, we essentially, because we don't have that validation, we need to try and help whoever's using our templates. We need to help them understand what each parameter does so they can actually provide the right values and so their deployments can be successful. And what the description decorator does is it provides us a way to document the purpose of our parameters in a human readable way, so other users can understand what the purpose of that parameter is. So if we take this example here, we've got a parameter for our Cosmos DB account locations. And essentially what we're doing here is we're telling the user, okay, these are the locations in which this Cosmos DB account will be configured. And the parameter needs to be a list of objects, each of which has a location name property. So it's not perfect validation, but it's just a helpful guide to really tell whoever's using our Bicep template to say, okay, when I'm defining the locations for my Cosmos DB account, I need to have an array of objects with a location name property within that array. It's really good practice to actually provide descriptions for your parameters, because again, it makes your parameters a little bit more easy to understand. It can really guide the user and the developer, whoever's using that Bicep template, to understand the purpose of that parameter and provide them with the information of what the value for those parameters need to be. There is a thing to note when adding descriptions to our parameters, Stephen. What is that?
Yeah, so there are ways that we can surface our Bicep templates to our users to deploy, and one of those cases is in the portal. And if you deploy your template via a template spec so that you can deploy it into the portal, or can deploy it via the portal, those descriptions will show up with the parameters, helping your user be successful with the template, right? Rather than looking for a particular, rather than having to go and find the template and dig through it to see what kind of data structure it needed. So I think it's time to get a little hands-on, don't you?
Absolutely. Let's kick off into our first exercise. So
all right.
You'll be driving. Awesome.
I'll be driving. You want to kind of coach me through what we're going to be doing?
Sure. So essentially what we're going to be doing in this is we'll have our Bicep template and we're going to be adding parameters and decorators to it. So
we're going to start off. I think we need to create a new file, our main.bicep. Let's just save that. So I'm in Visual Studio Code. I've already created our, so if you're following along, I've already created my sandbox, and so I've made sure my CLI is authenticated, and so we're going to create a main.bicep. I've got the Bicep extension installed in Visual Studio Code, so we'll get some help. Yeah, we'll get some help as we go. Now, for the sake of time, and because it's also provided for us in the Learn module, we'll do a little copy paste here to get us started. This is the start of our template. And you can see we've got a number of parameters defined. And Will, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that we might be seeing here in like, for example, the solution name? Something that might be happening?
Yeah, so that unique string function is a pretty cool function that we've got in Bicep because it's useful for creating globally unique resource names. So essentially what that function does, it will just return a string that's the same on every deployment to the same resource group. But it's different when you deploy those, when you deploy it to different resource groups or subscriptions. So that's one way we can actually kind of customize the values of our parameters, but just letting Bicep do it for us. There's also the resource group, so we're essentially passing through the resource group ID to that unique string. You've got your object parameters there as well, and then your parameter names that you've defined at the very start of your Bicep template. We can actually use those values further down in our Bicep template. So on lines 10 and 11, we're using that within our app service plan name. We're using the environment name and the solution name, and we're also using it for our app service app name as well. So it's
great.
That's a pretty cool thing that we can do in Bicep.
Wonderful. So now we'll move on. We'll start, and we can see some squiggles under some of the values, and that's because we haven't used them yet. We'll get those there. One of the nice things about that unique string and using the resource group ID is it's not a completely random string. It is deterministic. So if we give it the same seed, we'll get the same unique values out. So if we redeploy this template over the top, it's not going to regenerate solution name every single time, right? So we can keep some consistency there, and so that our deployments can be idempotent, or that they'll only change what they need to change. So we've added some app service resources, and we're accessing some of the value from our parameters, our object parameters. We can use that dot notation that Will told us about before. And now that we've got that, we've got some resources, we're using our parameters, let's go through and add some of those descriptions that Will told us are really, really helpful. So spacing is your friend. All right, this is starting to get a little tight, a little consolidated here. So I can add some extra spaces here. That's not going to throw off my template or anything. It just makes it a little easier to read because I can see the description as it's connecting very nicely with the parameter that it describes, rather than just sort of like one big block of code. Because, for example, if I put that in there, this starts to run together a little bit, and it's not as easy to read at first glance.
It's very, very busy.
Yeah. So adding a little bit of spacing while it spreads out my file does improve the readability, especially if I have longer descriptions on things. And when we describe some of our arrays or objects, we might have a little longer description. So we might, so having that space is quite helpful. So we'll save that as we go along. And let's try out our allowed as well. Right, so allowed, Will, if you want to refresh us on what allowed does.
So the allowed parameter just essentially says, okay, these are the values that we're allowed to use for this particular parameter. So looking at your environment name there, we're defining the allowed values of dev, test, and prod. So essentially those are 3 environments. So it makes sense to say, okay, these are the allowed values for this particular parameter.
Very cool. And yep, and just like our stated goals, right? We want to be able to create those environments. Now for our solution name, we put some length constraints around it. We want to make sure it's at least 5 characters and no longer than 30. And for the number of app services, we want to find our instance count here. And let's make sure that that's at least 1, but no more than 10.
Yeah.
Because if we do more than 10, our finance department's going to be really unhappy with us. So,
and we're not speaking from experience, just we just assume.
I actually manage the cloud advocacy team's Azure subscriptions, so it hits really close to home because I watch that budget. Even though we work for Microsoft, I don't get unlimited Azure. It can feel like it sometimes, but we're responsible for every dollar we spend. So, all right, we now have our full-on template here. We can go deploy that into Azure. We won't stick around for the full-on deployment because we'll get to see some of this again later. But we'll get the deployment started. So I'm going to set my default resource group to my resource group in my Learn Sandbox. And then we'll deploy our template. Oh, where did I save this file? Oh, I saved this file in the wrong place. So if you don't save your file in the right place, you can have problems. So let's see your reveal. We'll just go to get this in the right place. There we go. Now we should be.
You see how far there?
Because you can't deploy a file if it doesn't exist in the place that you expect it to be. All right, so that's going.
Try logging in.
Yeah.
And then setting up the subscription.
I will kick this off. Let's jump back to the slides. I will get this deployment kicked off, but we should continue on because we have a limited time and a lot of good information to share.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
So now that, so why don't you no, go for it. Let's get dug into providing some values for these parameters that we have now declared.
Yeah, so we don't have to provide the values to our parameters within our Bicep template. We can use parameter files. Now, parameter files makes it really easy to specify our parameter values together as a set. And if you're coming from an ARM template background, this is going to look very familiar. In fact, it's the same. Because within the parameter file, we provide our values for our parameters in your Bicep file, and these files are created in JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation language. You can supply a parameter file when we're deploying our Bicep template, so that little command that Steve ran earlier, we can deploy our template and also reference to a template file. And here is what in a Bicep template will look like. So here we've got a schema, which essentially defines what kind of schema format we're going to be using in our JSON file. The content version specifies a version of this parameter file. Now, it's usually set to 1.000 there, but you can use that for versioning. So you can version your parameter files as well, which is pretty cool. And then you've got your parameters. And within your parameters, essentially, this lists each parameter and value that we want to use. So parameters are defined as an object within our JSON file, and then we'll provide the parameter name and also give it a value. So here in our sample, we've got an app service plan instance count, and we're providing a value of 3 as our parameter value. Generally, a good idea, a good practice is to create a parameter file for each environment. So you'll have a parameter file for your dev environment, your test environment, and your prod environment. And it's a good idea to include the environment name within your parameter file. So you might have parameters -dev.json or parameters-prod.json, for example, or main.parameters.dev.json. So whatever naming convention works for you, but it's just a good idea to explicitly say, hey, these are my dev environment parameters. Make sure that when we're deploying it, deploying these resources, we just deploy those resources to our dev environment rather than a production environment.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I found out what the error was. I had the wrong subscription ID selected in my, so I had multiple concierge subscriptions. So if you do a lot of learn modules, this can happen at times. So I had to find the right concierge subscription to get deploying into. So we've got that running. Actually, it just completed. So let's hop back into our slides so we can continue talking about these wonderful parameter files. Now, Will, if we drill down here and we see, so we can see in our, we have our parameter name, app service plan SKU, just like what we defined earlier in one of our examples. And then the syntax here isn't the same as in our Bicep template. This is JSON, right? So this is, so when we provide a value for that, we can see our structured object, we have our name and our tier. So it's the same structure as what we expect to see inside of our Bicep template, but it's expressed in JSON.
Yeah,
that looks familiar. Will,
yeah, it is. If you're coming from an ARM background, one of the best things about your existing environments, you don't have to. If you're thinking, well, we're going to move from, we'd like to move from ARM to Bicep. The great thing about that is all you need to really change is your Bicep templates. And there are commands that we can actually do to actually decompile our JSON code into Bicep code. And we can just leave our parameter files as they are. So if you're coming from an ARM template background, you can just leave these parameter files alone and just essentially just focus on your Bicep templates, which is really cool.
Oh, good to know. All right, so now, Will, if we want to deploy, so use the parameter files at deployment time, is this really different than what we would do with a JSON template for an ARM JSON template? It looks pretty similar.
It is, yeah. It's essentially the same process, right? So within this command, we're running our az deployment group create command. Our template file is a Bicep file. So that main.bicep file that you created just now, that would be our template file. And then for our parameter files, we just use the JSON parameters file, and we'd use that as our parameters for our template.
Okay. And if we were doing this in PowerShell, it would be new AZ resource group deployment, and we'd have a template parameter file argument. So
yeah,
pretty similar experience.
Yeah.
Now, we were able to define a default value for our parameter in our template. Now we just talked about a parameter file. And there's one other option which you probably saw if you watched one of the earlier Learn modules, or if you go through the whole learning path, you'll have already seen how we could supply a parameter at the command line. And we'll show an example of that in coming up as well. So you won't, if you didn't see it before, you'll see it again. But there's an order of precedence here. So if there's no other option for the parameter, and there's a default value, that's what it's going to start as. Otherwise, if there's something in a parameter file, that will override the default in the template. If we supply something at the command line, that would override even the parameter file. So let's just take a quick look through here how these declarations look. So if we start in the Bicep template, and I believe that's our next slide.
Yeah.
Yep. And so we've got some stuff defined here. You want to walk us through?
Yeah, so within our Bicep template, we've defined our location using the resource group location, and we've also provided default values for our app service instance count, and we've also got our object for our app service plan SKU. So these are the default values that we provide at our template. If we take this a step further by looking at our parameter file, again, like I said, parameter files makes it really easy to specify parameter files as a set. So here we're not overriding, we haven't got a location, but we have got a app service plan instance count. So we've got that value set as free in our parameter file. And we also have our app service plan SKU. So we have the name is a P1v3 and the tier is premium free. And then if we look at the, the command line, which I have, there we go. That's better. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So we're here at the command line. We're now defining some parameters. So we're defining a new parameter for, specifying a new value for our parameter app service plan instance count, and we're setting that as 5. So Stephen, why would we want to specify a parameter at the command line, say over a parameters file?
I might do this if I'm spinning up a dev environment to test something. Maybe I've only run it with one app service instance, and now I want to see how this works with 2. Or maybe I need to try it with a different naming convention, or just maybe we bumped into a problem, or we want to try and see what something else is doing. This lets me use all of the other same parameters. I don't have to redeclare them, or I don't have to re-specify them at the command line, and I can just change the thing that I want to change and see that impacted across the pipeline. Another area where this might come into play is if I'm passing in if I'm passing in a secure value, right? I might want to pass it. I don't want that declared in my parameters file. And if you don't want to use key vault, and the technique that we'll show you in a little bit, I could potentially provide a secure value, as a override in through there.
Yeah. Another example that I've just thought of now, thanks for reminding me. So in my job, I teach a lot of people how to deploy Bicep templates through GitHub Actions. And part of that, I'll have a workflow, say, for example, building container images. So I'll build my container image, I'll deploy it to a container registry like Azure Container Registry. And since that the name of the container image changes every time I build it and deploy it to my Azure Container Registry, when I'm deploying my app service, I'll need to provide that container image name to my app service when I'm deploying it. And since it changes, that's really handy to be able to specify that as a parameter in the command line, so I can just deploy that new image to my app service every time I'm building it.
And so something to note here is it doesn't have this parameter that we're overriding at the command line doesn't have to necessarily be specified in the parameters.json. It could just be a parameter that's exposed via the template, right? I don't have to have a value in all 3 places, right? It is one of, right? And then there's the order of precedence in terms of which is going to win.
Yeah.
So yeah, the GitHub Actions, that scenario is a really common one as well for providing those overrides at the command line at runtime.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes, Will, I think I mentioned secure parameters, right? Sometimes we might need to pass some sensitive information. What are our options here? What can we do?
Well, like you said, we will inevitably have to pass sensitive values into our deployments. So like password keys, they could be API keys. But we need to ensure that these values are protected, right? We don't want to leak our credentials to everybody and anyone in the world. And in some situations, we don't even want the person who's creating the deployment to know the secret values either. Other times, someone will enter the parameter value that they create during the deployment, but you need to make sure that these secret values aren't logged. So essentially, what we're going to be talking about now is how we can actually protect the values of those parameters and a few tricks and tips that we can do to actually secure them.
Yeah, so one of the best ways is not to have the credential in the first place, or not to manage the credential in the first place. And if we're working with resources in Azure and you can leverage managed identities, that can be a tremendous help in reducing the secrets that you need to specify inside your templates. It also, because they're part of the Azure Fabric, we can reference those identities inside of our template, and the Fabric handles all the authentication stuff that we need to do. So managed identities, they're not available for every resource, but if they're there and you can use them, I would strongly recommend it.
Yeah. And I think with one of the benefits of managed identities, you can actually provide more granular roles and responsibilities to those particular Azure resources. If we take Cosmos DB as an example, the connection string is you can have an admin connection string, and that can let you do anything within that Cosmos DB account, which is useful, but it's also, there is a risk there because essentially you can drop databases, delete data, and just, if the wrong person got their hands on those credentials, they can create all kinds of havoc for you. So like you said, managed identities make your life a lot more simpler, and it can make those permissions a lot more granular as well.
So, Will, how do we tell our Bicep template that we have something that we don't want to be broadcast all over, or available in logs, or returned in our returned in the output of our template?
We can use the secure decorator. So essentially what the secure decorator does, we can apply that to string and object parameters that might contain secret values. And when we define a parameter as secret, what Azure does, it doesn't make it available to the deployment logs, which is really handy. So say if someone's using a secure parameter and the curiosity gets the better of them, going, oh, I wonder what that is. They can't go into the log and just look at the value of that. The secure parameter actually protects that value for us. Also, if you create the deployment interactively using the CLI or PowerShell, and you need to enter the values during the deployment, so if you know the value and you have to enter it during the deployment, when you're running on the terminal, it doesn't display it on the screen and actually protects it, which is pretty neat and pretty cool.
Very cool, because then that won't get caught then in, like, if you have a screen a console logger or something running, that's gonna grab that for you.
Yeah.
So, all right, now with I mentioned outputs a little moment ago. Will, is there any guidance around outputs in sensitive data?
Yeah, make sure that you don't create outputs that include sensitive data. Please don't do that, because essentially what that will do is those output values you can access those by anyone who has access to the deployment history. So anyone who can see the deployment of a particular module, they'll be able to actually see that secret sensitive data if you use it as an output. So say if you're using, say, an App Insights instrumentation key or Cosmos DB connection string as an output for a module, people who have access to that deployment history, they'll be able to see it. So they're not appropriate for handling secrets. So please don't do it. It's not a good idea.
So if you just have, for example, just have reader access in your in a resource group, you can go to those resource group deployments and take a look in the deployments for what the outputs were from previous deployments, and you can find stuff there. So yeah, it's not a great place to stick stuff.
No,
that is important to control access to. All right. Now, should we put our parameter then? Parameter files, while we could maybe secure them, file permissions are a thing, but very often these are getting checked into Git repositories. Very often these things are being shared amongst a number of folks who are using the same template. So parameter files, not a great place for storing your secrets. Now, we may need to pass a secret through the parameter file, but it's having the clear text secret in your parameter file, not a great experience, right?
No.
Especially not in version control, because again, having managed our team's Azure subscriptions, when a secret that refers to a resource in an existing Azure subscription lands in GitHub, and especially in a public repository, all sorts of fun stuff starts to happen, and you have to get into editing Git history and asking GitHub support to kindly flush the cache and their web cache for a particular page, so that things go away and and life can go back to normal. There's also all sorts of secret rotation that needs to happen. So please, 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 do not put secrets in parameter files and check them in, especially the public repos, but just in general, it's just not a great experience.
Well, since you asked so nicely, no, it's a really important point. Yeah, because the last thing you want is malicious actors to scan through your Git history, trying to find any credentials, and then all of a sudden, hey, I've got access to the production database. Let's have some fun. Yeah, it's not a good idea.
So if they shouldn't be in our parameter file, well, where should they be?
Well, what we can do is we can actually integrate our Bicep templates with Azure Key Vault. Now, for those of you who never heard of Azure Key Vault before, essentially it's a service designed to store and provide access to our secrets. And what we can do is we can integrate our Bicep templates with Key Vault by using a parameter file, but rather than providing the value of the secret, we can provide it with a reference to that Key Vault secret. And we can use this feature by referring to the Key Vault and the secret in the parameter file. So essentially, the value is never exposed because we're only referencing the identifier, which isn't secret within itself. So when we deploy our template, what Azure Resource Manager will do is it will contact Key Vault and retrieve the data for us, which is pretty cool. And another cool thing about Azure Key Vault is we can refer to secrets in Key Vaults that are located in different resource groups and even different subscriptions. So say you're working for a large enterprise and you have like a centralized Key Vault and you're deploying a new application within its own separate resource group. You can retrieve Key Vaults from that centralized secrets from that centralized Key Vault to use in your parameter file for your Azure resources that you're deploying to a separate resource group, which is pretty cool, pretty neat.
Yeah, that's helpful because there's a lot of scenarios where we have shared Key Vaults for different environments, shared Key Vaults for a bunch of different projects that may live in different subscriptions or at least in different resource groups. Now, how does it look to reference? Now, this is a bunch of small text, and so I apologize for that. But subscription ID or resource IDs are long, and so what we have here is in our parameters file, we specify that instead of a value, we're going to say a reference, and then we tell it what type of reference. It's a Key Vault reference. We give it the ID of the Key Vault, and that's why it can be in a different subscription or in a different resource group. Is that ID will specify what subscription and resource group to go look in for that Key Vault. And then we give it the secret name that we want it to look up. And actually we had a question come in from YouTube, from Siegfried, that asked about a Bicep script to create a Key Vault and pass the values of those secrets via Key Vault. And there is sort of a way to do that, and we're going to come up to that. We're going to come up to the syntax for looking up the same secret that the method I just talked about here in the parameter file. There's a way that we can do that directly in our Bicep template as well. And so we'll take a look at that in just a moment. I don't have the full-on script to create the key vault and populate it with secrets, but there are examples out there for that. And I'm not sure if Victor passed you a specific example, but I know they do exist. All right, so as I just referenced, right, we can use key vault in our Bicep template, and modules are a way that we can break up the structure of our Bicep template and then reference them from a more centralized template. And we got a little reaction from Siegfried. Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here and watching with us, and asking questions. Now, so because we can break this up into modules, from that module, from the main module, Bicep module that we're calling into these other ones, we can, Will, if you'll walk us through it, in the next slide here, we've got an example of how we would reference an existing key vault. Yeah. Now, for Siegfried, if this was a new key vault, it would just be a resource declaration, right? And we could point to that resource declaration the same way. But here we have an existing one. Why don't you walk us through a little bit of what's happening here?
Yeah, so like you said, this is an existing key vault that we're using. So we define it as a normal resource, but the key thing to note here is we've got that existing keyword. So essentially that tells our Bicep template, hey, this resource already exists, but I still want to use it. So we bring that into our Bicep template and we provide the name of our key vault. And then there's this cool key vault function here, essentially .getSecret. And what that does is it will call our key vault and retrieve the secret, we'll retrieve the name of the secret that we want to use, and it will retrieve the value of that particular secret. So in this example here, I've got this application module that I'm using. We're using our existing key vault, bringing that into our Bicep template. And then for our API key parameter, we're saying, hey, call my key vault and get that secret API key so I can use it within this module here.
Awesome. All right. I think it's time to get our hands dirty with some code again for a little bit. What do you think, Will?
Absolutely. Let's learn how we can actually use parameter files and also secure our parameters as well.
All right, so let's go back to my Visual Studio Code. And we've got our starting template. And from there, we're going to add some security to this experience here. And we're also, let me take a step back. We're going to start with a parameter file, and then we'll add some key vault. So we're going to get to do a little bit of fun stuff here. Now, first we need to take some secure parameters. And in our examples, we talked about a SQL administrator login and a SQL administrator password. So let's drop those things in here. Fortunately, the Learn module exercise gives us our descriptions and scaffolds out a bunch of stuff for us. If I wasn't using the Learn module, the Visual Studio Code extension is really, really helpful and gives me a bunch of snippets to start from. A basic param, a param with defaults, param with default allowed values, a secure parameter. Right? There's a number of different ways that we can kind of get started. The exercise in the Learn module gives us everything that we need to do to focus on the important concepts here. All right, we need a couple more variables. So we'll drop those in. We have a SQL Server name. Oh, helps if I copy the right thing. We have a SQL Server name and a SQL Server database. And you can see I get some indicators that these haven't been used in resources yet. So it's constantly checking my Bicep code to make sure that I am following best practices. So now we have those. We need some resources to reference them, right, Will?
Yes, we need to actually create a SQL Server and a database.
And looky here. Now, again, we can get some help I wanted to create another one, oh, it helps if I spell resource correctly, because otherwise it won't give me help. See, there we go. It's watch Steve type. So we get completion and help for all these different resource types, and it can help us find the right properties and things like that as well. So even if you go on, after you go on past this learn module, there is help to get these things done and to provide for a really nice experience. So here we're using some variables. We're using some of our parameters to specify the location. And then we have our secret values, our secure values of SQL Administrator login and SQL Server Administrator password. We have our objects where we're using a dot notation. So we're continuing to build on the patterns that we learned in the first one, as well as adding in some of that secure, those secure values.
And it's really nice if you hover over your SQL Server Administrator login as well, because we've added those descriptions in as well. We actually get that pop up as well. So we don't have to keep navigating to the top of our file to say, okay, what was this parameter for? Because we provided that description, that's a really helpful guide to actually say what this parameter actually is and what its purpose is.
That really good point out. Really good point there, Will. Yeah, all of the tooling can take advantage of that description. It can be in our error messages if we skip a parameter or we provide an improper value, right? We can get back information about that there. We get the preemptive help inside Visual Studio Code with the hover over. So, all right. So now we've got our Bicep template updated. I've saved it. I've saved it in the right place in my file system. So learning from my previous mistakes. And now we want to deploy this particular template. Oh, nope. We need to our parameter file. Then we want to deploy it. So yeah, keep me honest here, Will. Don't let me skip stuff. So let's create a new file. We will save this as main.parameters JSON, main.parameters.
Do you want to put your environment in there? Yeah.
Yep. Good catch. This is why we're working together. Two sets of eyes are better than one. I am Absolutely. A big fan of pairing on things. All right. So let's drop some parameters in there. So for my dev environment, I want to use the F1 free app service SKU and database SKU standard. Now, you'll notice I don't have all of my parameters declared here. I just have some of them. Some of them in my template have some default values assigned, right? And some of them I'm providing, and some of them I'm not. So let's see what happens, right? Watch what happens next. That's right. So we want to deploy our template, but now I want to provide a parameters file. All right, we've got our parameters file, and let's see.
Watch this happen.
So what we're gonna, yeah. So what's happening now is we need to provide a SQL Server Administrator login because we didn't provide it, and there's no default value. So let's call this learn live admin, and because it was secure, we didn't echo anything out on the screen, right? All right, now hopefully I can remember these for later.
Don't tell me.
I'll share with everybody. Sharing passwords on a live stream, almost as bad as checking them, especially one that's being recorded and replayed later. almost as bad as sticking it in version control and pushing it to a public GitHub repo. So I won't do that. But this is going to run, and one of the things when this completes, what I want to show you, we'll hop over into the Azure portal, and so we can see the inputs that came into this template, and I want to verify that our secure parameters do not show up there. And while that's actually running, we can actually go check out. So I've got my resource group here. We can go to deployments. We should already have, yep, we can see it's deploying there. And when this completes, there's this inputs. We might actually be able to see the inputs now. Might be able to just, yes, we can.
There it is.
All right. So we don't even have to wait. That's always nice. So we get our environment name. Here's our unique ID that we created. App service plan instance count, database SKU that we provided, app service SKU, location.
But no administrator login or password.
Exactly. They were provided because the template's moving forward and it was required, but they're just not echoed back out here. So, and what you may or may not know is all these details about the template can be retrieved via the CLI, via Azure PowerShell. And so those values are going to be protected that whole time. All right. So that guy is going to be running here for a little bit. While that is going, let's start getting our key vault set up. So for our key vault, we need to create one. And so I'm going to add another terminal. Yes, I know I need to update my PowerShell.
I have the same warning too. Don't worry, it's fine. We'll get to it later. It's fine.
All right. So we need a key vault name. Now, you may notice I'm in Azure PowerShell, or I'm in PowerShell, but I'm running Azure CLI commands. The stuff works in both places. We could just as easily be using the PowerShell alternatives. I like to switch it up every now and again. So let's give our key vault name. We'll go learn live bicep parameters. Let's just bicep params. Make sure it's short enough. All right. And then we want login is going to be learn live admin. Hopefully that's what I remember writing. And then actually, if we could just jump over to the slides for half a second while I type in the password here, that would be helpful.
I know the attendees were wanting to see that password, so it's good that we did that. And I was also interested too, as well. So
Yeah.
Don't tell me.
All right, and we can come back to my window here. I've run a clear screen, so we should be good to go here. Now we're going to create a key vault, and we'll give it the name, give it the location, and there's a switch enabled for template deployment set to true, and that's what allows our key vault secrets to be accessed by the parameters file and by that module syntax reference that we showed.
Nice.
If we don't enable that for template deployment, we're gonna hit errors trying to access that. Now, while that's running, it should just take a moment or two. What we're going to do next is we're going to create a couple of secrets for our SQL Server Administrator login and password, and then we'll update our and then we can update our reference there to in our parameters file so that we can use those values.
Nice, that was created.
Yep, we've got that there. Let's get these things created. And once we get them created and we can reference that, we'll get moving right along to the next step. And let's pop off my screen one more time because where the value is going to show up. There we go. Because I think I just noticed something. We can go back to Visual Studio Code. We echo out a response on the CLI. I think I have a bug report or a feature request to not echo out secrets as we when we create secret resources from the CLI. But because we just finished telling everyone not to do that themselves, right? So now that we have that key vault created, we can go and add in a reference to, there we go. So we need to get our key vault resource ID. So our key vault resource ID should be.
We can run an azcli command as well for that.
Yep. That's what we got going here. We're going to take that ID and we'll drop that in here.
Awesome. And that just points to our key vault resource.
Yep. And let's see. So that one's done. We'll start this guy. That's going to go. Now we're getting down towards the end of time, so let's go. Let's go back to our slide deck. We've got a few more slides to touch on, and we have a little bit of question and answer to do with the audience. So we right into the knowledge check. Good deal.
Exactly.
All right. So if you've been following along, and we've made sense. This should be this question should give you a little bit of exercise into what we've just covered. Now, and just so y'all know, the deployment completed successfully. Just came back, so that means it read our secrets, and life is good. Now, knowledge check. Will, do you want to kind of set the stage here for this knowledge check?
Absolutely. Let's test the good folks watching the stream. So we're deploying a template that one of your colleagues has written, and they've given you a Bicep template named main.bicep with these parameter definitions. So we've got a project name with a maximum length, a string parameter for project name with a max length of 5 for dog. And we've also got a secure parameter decorator for our API key. However, they also give us a parameter file named main.parameters.production.json. And we've got our parameters there. So we've got our project name, but this time it's got a value of cat. And we've also got a reference to our key vault, but it's referencing a secret called key to access partner API. And then finally, we're going to deploy our template using the command line. And here, we're specifying our project name parameter and giving that the value of bird. So the question is, what will the value of the project name parameter be when this template is deployed? Will it be dog? Will it be cat? Or will it be bird? So go to aka.ms/polls and answer the question. What one do you think it's going to be? Stephen, do you have an idea of what it might be?
I do, and I think this is a test of memory, really looking at what the different options were. So let's just recap verbally kind of where this is for folks. So my default parameter value for project name was dog.
Yes.
My parameter file has cat.
Yes.
Right. And I supplied a project name of bird at the command line when this is being deployed.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that both of the either the parameter file or the CLI value is going to override the default in the template. So I'm pretty sure it's not dog.
Okay.
Right. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking because we provided it at the we provided a parameter value for project name at the command line, that might take precedence over our parameter file and also the default value that we provided in our template. So votes are coming in.
Yep. And
the answer is, if I can get PowerPoint to work, bird. Awesome. Yeah. So like I said, parameter files will override the default parameter values. However, when we specify values of parameters in the command line, those will overwrite our parameters that we have in our parameter file. So in our case, we supplied bird in the command line. So that's going to take precedence over our parameter file and our default parameter value in our template. All right.
Great.
On to the next question.
Let's look at the next one. All right. So you read the last one. I'll read this one. Now, which of the values for the project name parameter would result in a deployment error? A, an empty string. B, 1. Or C, animal. So head over to aka.ms/polls and chime in with an answer. And Will, what are you thinking here?
Well, the project name will be a string parameter. So if I put 1, it's going to complain instantly. The template's going to say, hey, this is a string parameter. It's not gonna work out. Now, if I go back to the template for a second, let's verify a couple of things. So we've got animal there, which is 6 letters or 6 characters, and we've defined a max length of 5. So I'm thinking that's going to cause a bit of an issue as well. Oh, I skipped to the wrong side.
Well, I think we let the cat out of the bag, or the animal out of the bag in this case.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. Right. So our parameter validation only allowed for, or only set a maximum length, right? So an empty string would have been fine because we didn't specify a minimum. And 1 could be coerced or could be read as a string, right? It's a number. It would satisfy a number, but it could be typecast to being a string. So animal is our problem there. So now looking at what's come in across from our audience. So we had for question 1, we had 13 people all nail the right answer. Here we're split. There were some votes. There were 3 for empty string, 4 for 1, and 4 for animal. So it was a pretty even split there. Now I think we have, was it one more? We got one more question here. Will, yes. Why don't you take us through this one?
Okay, so here we want to view the value of our API key parameter after the deployment has been created. Which of these statements are true? We can't view the value of our API key parameter for the deployment. B, we can view the value of our API key parameter for this deployment by just going to the output of the deployment command. Or C, we can view the API key parameter by inspecting the resource script deployments in the Azure portal. So what Stephen did earlier, just as our deployment was kicking off, we went into the portal and we just we saw the inputs, we can also see the outputs. And that's one way. Can we see the API key parameter value by doing that?
Yeah. So I'm going to say that we're not going to see API key. Let's see. I don't think it's that we can view it in the portal because we went and checked that, right?
Yeah.
We actually walked through and loaded up the portal, went into inputs. We saw the outputs from some of the stuff. So I don't think it's going to be C. So that means it's either that we could view it in the output or we can't view it. Now, let's see. So if we could view it in the output, it could be true if somebody made that actually happen. However, by default, I think the behavior is going to be A. What do you think, Will?
I think you're right. I think just looking at the time.
Yep, we got about 5 minutes left here. Just a little, actually 4 minutes left. So why don't we see? Let's check in with our audience and see where they're landing on this question.
Mostly A. It's good. A couple for B.
Yep. So for the folks who are answering B, the only way that would be possible is if somebody actually specifically found took that value and mapped it into outputs. You can do it. You probably shouldn't do it. So the default behavior would be A, that you wouldn't be able to view that.
And what that secure parameter does, it essentially, if we were to run our deployment on command line, the output, it doesn't actually get shown in the output as well. It only ever gets shown in the output if we're using it as output for modules. That's the trick that you need to just be mindful of when using secrets. So when you're using secure parameters, when you see that little JSON output that you may have seen in the command line, you won't see the value of your secrets that way. So you won't be able to view the value of the API key parameter when you're deploying.
Well, why don't we wrap it on up here? So we have, let's take a look at look back at our learning objectives. Right. So we customized parameters and limited values that could be used in them.
Yeah.
We looked at the different ways that we could supply parameters to a Bicep template deployment. Mm-hmm. And we secured some parameters. So I think we hit our objectives. I think the HR department at Tailwind or at Tailspin Toys is going to be happy with us.
That's good. You always got to keep customers happy.
Now, where can folks go to learn more on this? So
to learn more, to actually take your time and going through the module yourself, do check out aka.ms/learnlive 2022-03-22A/summary. That will give you more information about the topics that we've discussed in this module. And coming up next week,
yes,
we have a video. We have another Learn Live session on.
Next slide. Yep.
Next slide. Sorry.
Yeah.
PowerPoint is killing me today. I'm going to need that cup of coffee. We're going to be learning how to build flexible Bicep templates by using conditions and loops. That's on March the 29th, 10 a.m. Pacific time. So don't miss out. Join us then.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Will, for bringing your time, giving of your time, giving of your experience. Thank you to our audience who joined us today, asked questions, participated in our little Q&A. You all did wonderful. Appreciate you. And thank you to Victor, who's been helping tirelessly in our chat, even though it's been nice and early, and Laurent, who produced the show for us today. Thank you all, and we'll see you back here next week.
Bye, everyone.